A fireplace is a machine for wasting heat. This is not an opinion. This is physics. A conventional open fireplace with a single straight flue, the kind that every American frontier cabin was built with, the kind that Benjamin Franklin himself described as an inefficient and wasteful device, converts fuel to heat at an efficiency of approximately 10 to 15%. That means for every cord of wood burned in a standard fireplace, 85 to 90% of the heat energy goes up the chimney and into the sky. It heats the clouds, it heats the birds, it heats everything except the room it is supposed to be heating. The fire looks warm. The fire feels warm if you are standing directly in front of it. But 3 feet to the side, the temperature drops sharply, and at the far wall of the room, it is barely warmer than outside, because the radiant heat from the fire reaches only the surfaces it can see, and the convective heat, the hot air, rises straight up and out of the flue before it can circulate through the room. The reason for this waste is simple. Hot air rises. Combustion gases from a wood fire are between 800 and 1200 degrees Fahrenheit, and they are lighter than the surrounding air, and they rush upward through the flue at a velocity of 10 to 20 feet per second, and they carry their heat with them. A straight vertical flue is a highway for this heat to escape. The gases enter the flue at the firebox at 800 to 1200 degrees, and they exit the chimney top at 600 to 800 degrees, which means the flue has extracted only 200 to 400 degrees of temperature from the gases during their brief passage through the masonry. The stone or brick of the flue absorbs some of this heat and radiates it into the room, but the contact time between the hot gases and the flue walls is measured in seconds, perhaps 2 to 4 seconds in a 10-foot flue. And that is not enough time for the masonry to absorb more than a fraction of the available heat. The rest goes out the top, wasted, gone, heating the winter sky while the family shivers 10 feet from the fire. Now, what if the flue was not straight? What if instead of rushing the combustion gases vertically from firebox to chimney top in 4 seconds, you routed them horizontally through channels that ran through the walls of the house, turning and bending and passing through room after room before finally rising to the chimney cap? What if instead of 2 to 4 seconds of contact between hot gases and masonry, you gave the gases 30 to 60 seconds? What if you doubled or tripled the length of the flue path, forcing the gases to surrender their heat to hundreds of pounds of stone and brick and mortar before they were allowed to escape? This is what the Hutsul people of the Carpathian Mountains had been doing for centuries. The Pich, the traditional Carpathian masonry stove, was not a fireplace. It was a heat exchanger, a massive structure of stone and clay, sometimes weighing 2,000 pounds or more, built into the center of the house with internal channels that routed combustion gases in a serpentine path through the masonry before releasing them to the chimney. A single fire in the firebox of a well-built Pich heated the entire structure. Walls, benches, sometimes even a sleeping platform on top, and the masonry held that heat for 12 to 18 hours after the fire went out. The exit temperature of the gases at the chimney top was 200 to 300 degrees, compared to 600 to 800 degrees in a conventional fireplace. That meant the Pich was extracting 60 to 70% of the available heat from the combustion gases, compared to 10 to 15% for an open fireplace. 4 to 6 times more efficient. 4 to 6 times less firewood for the same warmth. 4 to 6 times less labor, less cutting, less hauling, less cost. The engineering principle was not complex. It was surface area and time. The longer the gases spent in contact with the masonry, and the more masonry surface they touched, the more heat they surrendered. A straight flue 10 feet tall with an interior surface area of approximately 20 square feet extracted a small fraction of the heat. A serpentine flue path 25 feet long with an interior surface area of 60 to 80 square feet extracted the majority of it. The gases did not know the difference. They did not care whether the flue was straight or crooked. They simply lost heat to any cooler surface they touched, at a rate proportional to the temperature difference and the contact time, and a longer path with more surface meant more contact time and more heat transfer. This is the first law of heat exchange. It applies to radiators, to car engines, to industrial heat recovery systems, and to Carpathian masonry stoves built by hand from riverstone and clay 500 years ago. Taras Koval knew this the way he knew how to breathe. He had grown up in the Hutsul village of Verkhovina in the eastern Carpathians, in the mountains that straddle the border between what was then the Austro-Hungarian province of Galicia and the Romanian principality of Bukovina. His father, Dumitru Koval, was a Pich builder, a stove mason who traveled from village to village building and repairing the massive clay and stone heating stoves that were the center of every Hutsul household. Taras had apprenticed under his father from the age of 12, mixing mortar, cutting stone, learning the geometry of flue channels by drawing them in the dirt with a stick before laying the first stone. By 20, he was building Piches on his own. By 30, he had built more than 40, each one a custom design fitted to the specific house, the specific family, the specific arrangement of rooms and walls and sleeping areas that the stove needed to serve. The key insight that Taras carried across the Atlantic was not the Pich itself, which was too massive and too specific to Ukrainian house construction to transplant directly to an American log cabin, but the principle behind it. The branching flue. The idea that combustion gases from a single fire could be split at a junction point and routed through 2 or more separate channels, each serving a different room, before recombining at the chimney stack. In the Carpathians, this was standard practice for larger houses. A wealthy farmer's house might have a Pich with 3 or 4 branching flue paths, one heating the main room, one heating the sleeping chamber, one heating the storage room where food needed to be kept above freezing, and one heating the bench by the front door where a visitor could sit and warm himself before entering. The flue paths were controlled by clay dampers, sliding plates that could open or close individual channels, directing the hot gases to whichever room needed heat, and closing off rooms that did not. The entire system ran from a single firebox, a single fire, a single load of wood. Taras arrived in Pennsylvania in the spring of 1884 with Helena and their 2 children and $11. They settled in a valley in the western part of the state, in a loose cluster of homesteads that had been established over the previous decade by a mix of families: Pennsylvania Dutch, Scots-Irish, a few German families, and a growing number of Eastern European immigrants drawn by work in the timber and coal industries. The valley was narrow and heavily wooded, the ridges rising steeply on both sides, and the winters were hard, not as brutal as the Carpathians, but cold enough that heating was the dominant concern from November through March. Temperatures in January averaged 15 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit, with regular drops below 0, and the wind funneled through the valley like water through a pipe, finding every gap in every wall of every cabin and drawing the heat out. The first winter, 1884 to 85, the Covels lived in a rented cabin with a single fireplace and a straight flue. It was a standard American frontier fireplace, a stone firebox 4 feet wide and 3 feet deep with a vertical stone flue rising through the roof. It heated the main room adequately if you stood within 6 feet of it. But heat from a fireplace does not behave the way most people think it does. Most people think a fire heats a room by warming the air. This is only partially true. A fire heats the surfaces it can see, the floor in front of it, the walls to either side, the ceiling directly above, by radiant heat, which is infrared radiation that travels in straight lines from the fire to any surface with a line of sight to the flames. This radiant heat is what makes a fireplace feel warm when you stand in front of it. But radiant heat cannot turn corners. It cannot reach behind furniture. It cannot pass through walls or floors. The surfaces that the fire cannot see, the far wall, the floor behind the hearth, any room separated by a wall or a floor, receive no radiant heat at all. They are heated only by convection, by warm air circulating from the fire toward the cold surfaces. And in a cabin with a straight flue fireplace, the convective circulation is weak because the flue is pulling the warm air upward and out of the building as fast as the fire can produce it. The fireplace creates a draft. The draft sucks warm air out of the room through the flue. Cold air is pulled in through every gap and crack in the walls to replace the warm air that the flue is removing. The net effect is that a fireplace heats the area directly in front of it and actively cools the rest of the room by pulling in cold outside air. The fireplace in the rented cabin did not heat the sleeping loft above, which was separated from the main room by a plank floor that blocked the rising warm air. It did not heat the lean-to addition on the back of the cabin where the family stored food, and Helena did the washing. The family burned 6 cords of oak and hickory that winter, approximately $36 worth of purchased wood, or 30 days of cutting labor. And the sleeping loft was cold enough that the children slept in their coats under every blanket in the house, and the lean-to froze solid from December to March. The water bucket in the lean-to froze every night and had to be broken free with a hammer every morning. The butter froze. The potatoes in the root box froze and turned black and had to be thrown away. Helena lost approximately $15 worth of stored food to freezing that winter. Food that would have survived in a Carpathian house where the Pich kept every room above freezing. Taras spent that winter studying the cabin and planning. He did not complain about the cold. He measured it. He noted which walls were coldest, where the drafts entered, how the heat from the fireplace moved through the main room, and where it stopped. He sketched floor plans in a notebook, drawing flue paths with charcoal pencil, calculating channel dimensions, estimating masonry volumes. By March of 1885, he had a design, not a Pich. The cabin was too small and too lightly built to support a 2,000-pound masonry stove, but a branching chimney system that applied the Pich principle to an American log cabin. A single firebox feeding 2 flue channels that branched at a junction box above the firebox and ran horizontally through the shared walls before turning upward and joining at a single chimney stack above the roofline. He built the cabin in the summer of 1885. He chose a T-shaped floor plan, which was unusual for the valley. Most cabins were simple rectangles, but the T-shape was deliberate. The central stroke of the T was the main room, 16 by 18 feet, facing south. The left arm of the T was the sleeping room, 12 by 14 feet, sharing a wall with the main room on the east side. The right extension behind the main room was the workroom, 10 by 12 feet, sharing the north wall of the main room. This layout placed two interior walls adjacent to the main room, and these two interior walls were where the flue channels would run. The chimney mast sat at the junction of all three rooms, a massive stone and mortar structure, 4 feet wide and 3 feet deep, rising from a foundation of flat river stones laid on compacted gravel. The firebox faced into the main room, a cooking fireplace 3 feet wide and 2 feet deep, lined with firebrick that Taras had purchased from a brickyard in Pittsburgh for $4, the single largest expense of the entire build. The firebrick lining was essential. The firebox temperatures would reach 800 to 1,000 degrees during a hot burn, and common fieldstone could crack or spall at these temperatures. But firebrick was rated to withstand 2,000 degrees and would last decades without deterioration. Above the firebox, where a conventional chimney would have a single straight flue rising to the roof, Taras built a junction box. This was a rectangular chamber approximately 2 feet wide, 1 foot deep, and 1 foot tall, constructed of firebrick and mortared, with a heat-resistant mixture of fire-site clay and sand. The junction box was the heart of the system. Hot combustion gases rose from the firebox into the junction box, and from the junction box they could exit through 3 openings, one straight up into a conventional vertical flue for the main room, and 2 horizontal openings, one to the left into a flue channel that ran through the wall shared with the sleeping room, and one to the rear into a flue channel that ran through the wall shared with the workroom. Each horizontal channel was 8 inches wide and 6 inches tall, large enough for the gases to flow without excessive resistance, small enough to keep the gas velocity high so that turbulent flow maintained good contact between the gases and the channel walls. The channels ran horizontally through the walls for approximately 8 feet each, enclosed in masonry, river stone and mortar on the outside, firebrick lining on the inside, before turning upward through 90-degree bends and rising vertically to join the main flue above the roofline. The total flue path from firebox to chimney top through either horizontal channel was approximately 22 feet, compared to 10 feet for the straight vertical flue. The total interior surface area of each horizontal channel was approximately 44 square feet, compared to 20 square feet for the vertical flue. The gas contact time was approximately 15 to 20 seconds through the horizontal channels, compared to 2 to 4 seconds through the vertical flue. The dampers were Helena's suggestion, and they were the element that made the branching chimney a controllable heating system rather than just a passive heat distributor. In the Carpathians, the dampers on a Pich were traditionally made of flat stones that slid in grooves cut into the masonry. These stone dampers worked, but they were heavy. A stone plate large enough to seal an 8-inch channel weighed 3 to 4 pounds, and they were difficult to operate because the grooves accumulated mortar dust and site soot that made the plate stick and grind. Helena had watched her mother-in-law struggle with stone dampers for years in their Verkhovina house, and she had always thought there was a better way. She suggested using clay plates instead, flat discs of fired clay approximately 8 inches in diameter and half an inch thick, seated in clay collars built into the junction box at each horizontal opening. The clay plates could be rotated by a short iron rod that protruded through the chimney mass into the main room, and rotating the plate 90 degrees opened or closed the channel. Open, the plate sat parallel to the gas flow and offered minimal resistance. The gases flowed past it like water flowing past a flat stone in a creek. Closed, it sealed the channel completely and forced all gases through the remaining open channels. The clay plates were lighter than stone, less than a pound each, smoother in their operation because the fired clay surface was harder and less prone to binding than rough stone, and easier to replace if they cracked. The cracking was inevitable. After years of thermal cycling, heating to 300 degrees when the fire was burning, cooling to ambient temperature overnight, heating again the next evening, any ceramic material will eventually develop fatigue cracks. But Helena could make new plates from the same gray-brown river clay she used for pottery, formed on a flat board, trimmed to size with a knife, dried for a week, and fired in the cooking fireplace overnight. A replacement plate cost nothing but an evening's work and a handful of clay. The mortar for the chimney was another area where Helena's knowledge proved essential. Standard American chimney mortar was lime and sand, mixed approximately 1 part lime to 3 parts sand. This worked well for the exterior stonework, but it was not suitable for the interior of the flue channels where temperatures could reach 500 degrees. Lime sand mortar begins to deteriorate at temperatures above 600 degrees. The lime decomposes, losing its binding properties, and the mortar crumbles to powder. In the Carpathians, the interior of Pich flue channels was mortared with a mixture of firesite clay, sand, and chopped straw. The clay providing heat resistance up to 2000 degrees, the sand providing bulk, and the straw providing reinforcing fiber that prevented the mortar from cracking during the initial drying period. Helena mixed the flue mortar herself, using clay dug from the creek bank, sand from the same source, and straw cut into half-inch lengths from last year's wheat harvest. The mixture had to be the right consistency, wet enough to work into the joints with a trowel, dry enough to hold its shape without slumping, and the straw had to be distributed evenly throughout, which required kneading the mixture by hand for 20 minutes or more until every clump of straw was separated and every pocket of dry clay was wetted. She mixed the mortar in a wooden trough on the ground beside the chimney, and she made it fresh each morning because the clay began to set within 4 hours of mixing, and mortar that had begun to set would not bond properly to the firebrick. If you want to know what happened when a Carpathian stove builder applied centuries of Ukrainian heating engineering to an American log cabin, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Bernell Sefton watched the chimney go up with the expression of a man watching someone make an expensive mistake. Sefton was the local mason, a Pennsylvania-born man in his 60s who had built chimneys and fireplaces in the valley for 30 years. He was competent. His chimneys drew well, did not smoke, and lasted. He built them the way every American mason built them: a single firebox, a single straight flue, a stone cap, and he had never seen a reason to build them any other way. When he saw Taras building the junction box above the firebox, he walked over and looked at it and said, "The gases would not draw through a horizontal channel because hot air rises and will not go sideways." He said the horizontal channels would fill with smoke and back up into the rooms. He said the junction box would create turbulence that would cause the fireplace to smoke. He said all of this with the certainty of a man who has built 100 chimneys and has never built one with a horizontal channel, which meant he was extrapolating from experience that did not include the thing he was criticizing, which is the most common form of confident wrongness. Taras listened. He understood enough English by then to follow the argument. He did not disagree with Sefton, because disagreeing would have required a long technical explanation in a language he was still learning. And Taras was not a man who explained things with words. He explained things with stone. He said, "I will show you," and he continued building. The physics of why horizontal channels work is straightforward and does not require hot air to rise. It requires hot air to move, and hot air will move in any direction if there is a pressure difference driving it. A fire in a firebox creates a column of hot gas in the flue above it. This column is lighter than the surrounding air, and it rises, creating a low pressure zone at the base of the flue, at the firebox. The low pressure zone draws air into the firebox from the room, feeding the fire with oxygen, and the rising column of hot gas in the flue creates the draft that drives the entire system. In a conventional chimney, this draft pulls air straight up. In a branching chimney, the draft still pulls air upward through the vertical sections of the flue, and this upward pull creates a pressure difference that draws gases through the horizontal sections as well. The horizontal channel does not need the gases to rise through it. It needs the vertical section at the far end of the horizontal channel to pull the gases through. The horizontal channel is a connecting pipe between two vertical sections, the firebox column and the exit column, and the gases flow through it the same way water flows through a horizontal pipe, connecting two tanks at different levels. The driving force is the pressure difference, not the direction. The first fire was lit in October of 1885. Taras opened all three channels, the vertical and both horizontals, and built a small fire in the firebox with dry oak splits. The smoke rose from the firebox into the junction box and divided. Some went straight up the vertical flue. Some entered the left horizontal channel toward the sleeping room. Some entered the rear horizontal channel toward the workroom. Within 5 minutes, the draft had stabilized, and all three channels were drawing cleanly, the smoke flowing through the horizontal channels with no backflow, no turbulence, no smoking into the rooms. Taras placed his hand flat against the wall of the sleeping room, where the horizontal channel ran through the masonry. Cold stone. He waited. After 20 minutes, the stone was warm. After 40 minutes, it was hot enough that he could not hold his hand against it comfortably. The flue channel was working. The combustion gases were surrendering their heat to the masonry as they passed through the horizontal channel, and the masonry was radiating that heat into the sleeping room. He checked the workroom. Same result. The wall where the rear channel ran was warming steadily, the heat spreading outward from the channel through the surrounding stonework. One fire, 3 rooms, all heating simultaneously. Bernal Sefton came back in November after the first cold snap. He stood in the main room in front of the fireplace and felt the warmth. Then he walked through the doorway into the sleeping room and felt the warmth there. The wall where the flue channel ran was radiating steady, even heat into the room, despite there being no fire in the sleeping room, no fireplace, no stove, nothing but a warm wall. He pressed his hand against the plaster surface over the channel. It was the temperature of a warm bath, perhaps 105, 110 degrees, comfortable to touch, steady, the kind of heat that a cast iron stove produces, but without the stove, without the cost of a stove, without the fire risk of a stove, and without the fuel consumption of a second fire. If this story has touched you, share it and subscribe, because the quiet engineering that kept families warm and dry for generations deserves to be remembered. He checked the workroom. Same result. The wall where the rear channel ran was warming steadily, the heat spreading outward from the channel through the surrounding stonework, like warmth spreading through a blanket held near a fire. One fire, 3 rooms, all heating simultaneously. The heat was not the same in all 3 rooms. The main room, which had the firebox, was the warmest, receiving both the radiant heat from the flames and the convective heat from the rising warm air. The sleeping room was next, receiving steady radiant heat from the masonry wall where the horizontal channel ran. The workroom was the coolest of the three because its channel was slightly longer and had one more turn, which meant more resistance and slightly less gas flow. But all three rooms were warm. All three rooms were above 50 degrees by midnight when the fire had burned down to a bed of orange coals, and all three rooms were heated by one fire, one load of wood, one match. Taras tested the dampers. He closed the sleeping room channel by rotating the clay plate with the iron rod. The change was immediate. The flow through the remaining two channels increased. With one channel closed, all the gases were forced through the vertical flue and the workroom channel, increasing the velocity and the heat delivery to those two paths. The workroom wall temperature rose noticeably within 10 minutes. He closed the workroom channel as well, forcing all gases through the vertical flue only. The fireplace now operated like a conventional single-flue fireplace, all heat going to the main room. He opened the sleeping room channel and closed the vertical flue, forcing all gases through the sleeping room channel only. Maximum heat delivery to the sleeping room. Minimal heat to the main room beyond the radiant heat from the firebox itself. The system was controllable, directional. He could send heat where it was needed and withhold it from where it was not, and the control was as simple as turning an iron rod a quarter turn with 2 fingers. The practical implications of this control were significant. On a mild evening in October, when the outdoor temperature was 40 degrees and the cabin needed only light heating, Taras could open all 3 channels and burn a small fire, distributing a modest amount of heat evenly across all 3 rooms. On a bitter night in January, when the outdoor temperature was below 0 and the sleeping room needed maximum warmth, he could close the workroom channel and the vertical flue and send all the heat through the sleeping room channel, concentrating the entire output of the fire into the room where the children slept. On a morning when the main room needed to warm quickly for breakfast preparation, but the other rooms could wait, he could close both horizontal channels and run the fireplace as a conventional system, all heat going to the main room. No conventional fireplace offered this flexibility. No cast iron stove offered it. Only the branching chimney with damper control gave the family the ability to direct heat through their home, like water through an irrigation system, opening and closing channels to deliver warmth exactly where and when it was needed. He went outside and looked at the chimney top. A single column of smoke rose from the cap, lighter and thinner than the smoke from any other chimney in the valley, because the gases had already surrendered most of their heat to the masonry before reaching the chimney top. The exit temperature of the gases, which Taras later estimated by holding his hand above the chimney cap at various distances, was approximately 200 to 250 degrees, compared to 600 to 800 degrees in a conventional chimney. That meant the branching system was extracting approximately 70% of the available heat from the combustion gases, compared to 15% for a conventional fireplace. Sefton asked how much wood the system burned. Taras told him. In the first full winter, 1885 to 86, the Kovals burned 3¼ cords of mixed oak and hickory to heat all 3 rooms of the T-shaped cabin from November through March. The valley average for a single-room cabin with a conventional fireplace was 4½ to 5 cords. Larger cabins with 2 fireplaces, a main fireplace and a smaller one in the bedroom, burned 7 to 9 cords. The Kovals were heating 3 rooms with 3¼ cords. This was not a marginal improvement. This was a fundamental change in the economics of heating, achieved with a single fire and a chimney that cost $12 in materials, $4 for firebrick, $3 for lime, $2 for iron hardware, including the damper rods and a chimney cap, and $3 for sand and miscellaneous supplies. The river stone was free, gathered from the creek. The labor was Terrace's own, approximately 5 weeks of masonry work from foundation to cap. The sleeping room temperature, which in the rented cabin the previous winter had been cold enough to freeze water in a cup left overnight, now stayed between 50 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit through the night, even after the fire burned down to coals. This was the thermal mass effect. The masonry of the Flue channel, approximately 800 pounds of stone and mortar in the sleeping room wall alone, absorbed heat from the combustion gases during the evening burn and released it slowly through the night, the temperature of the wall dropping from 110 degrees at bedtime to perhaps 70 degrees by morning, and this slow, steady release of stored heat kept the room above 50 degrees until the morning fire was lit. The children slept without coats for the first time since arriving in America. Helena hung a thermometer on the sleeping room wall, a mercury tube she had purchased for 35 cents at the general store, and recorded the morning temperature every day through the winter. The lowest reading was 47 degrees, on a night when the outdoor temperature dropped to -8. In the rented cabin the previous winter, with a conventional fireplace, the sleeping loft had reached 14 degrees on a similar night. The workroom stayed above freezing all winter, which meant that Helena could store root vegetables, milk, butter, and eggs in the workroom without them freezing, and she could do washing and mending in the workroom in relative comfort rather than huddling by the main fireplace. The value of a third heated room in a frontier household was not easily measured in dollars, but it was measured in hours. Hours of productive work that Helena could do in a warm space instead of losing those hours to cold. Hours that contributed to the household economy in preserved food, repaired clothing, and prepared materials. Abner Griggs was the first neighbor to ask about the chimney. Griggs was a Scots-Irish farmer whose family had been in the valley since 1872, and he had rebuilt his fireplace twice in 13 years because the single straight flue cracked from thermal stress each time. The cracking was a common problem with fieldstone chimneys. The rapid temperature changes from lighting and extinguishing fires caused the stone to expand and contract unevenly, and after years of cycling, the mortar joints cracked and the flue began to leak smoke into the room. Griggs had patched and remortared his flue more times than he could count, and each repair lasted a shorter time than the last because the stones themselves were beginning to spall, the surface layers flaking off in thin sheets from repeated thermal stress, gradually widening the cracks and loosening the joints. He asked Taras how much it would cost to add a branching channel to his existing chimney. Taras looked at Griggs's chimney, looked at the cracked mortar, the spalled stones, the crooked flue that had settled unevenly over 13 years, and told him it could not be modified. The existing chimney mass was too narrow to accommodate a horizontal channel without tearing it down to the foundation and rebuilding, and the foundation itself was inadequate for the additional weight of a branching system. A branching chimney with one horizontal channel weighed approximately 3,000 pounds, the original firebox and vertical flue accounting for about 2,000 pounds, and the horizontal channel adding another 1,000 pounds of stone, firebrick, and mortar. This weight required a foundation of flat stones on compacted gravel at least 2 feet wider than the chimney base on each side, and Griggs's existing foundation was barely adequate for the chimney already standing on it. Griggs asked how much a complete rebuild would cost. Terrace calculated 3 weeks of masonry labor at $1.50 per day, plus materials. Firebrick for the firebox and channel lining, lime for mortar, iron hardware for the damper mechanism. $50 total. Griggs said he would think about it. He thought about it for 2 winters. During the first of those winters, Griggs's wife, Liddy, developed a persistent cough that the doctor attributed to sleeping in a cold room. The bedroom was unheated, and the temperature dropped below freezing regularly between November and March, and the combination of cold air and the wood smoke that leaked through the cracked flue into the bedroom was hard on her lungs. During the second of those winters, January of 1888, the temperature dropped to -14 degrees for 3 consecutive days, and Liddy told Griggs she was not spending another winter in a house with 1 warm room and 2 cold ones, and Griggs hired Terrace to rebuild the chimney. Terrace tore down Griggs's old chimney in a single day. The mortar was so deteriorated that the stones came apart with minimal effort, which told Terrace everything he needed to know about the quality of the original construction. And he laid a new foundation over the next 2 days, wider and deeper than the original, with a gravel drainage bed beneath it to keep groundwater away from the base. He built Griggs a branching chimney over the following 3 weeks. The design was simpler than the Koval cabin. Griggs had a rectangular 2-room cabin, not a T-shape, so the chimney needed only 1 horizontal channel, branching from the junction box to the bedroom on the east wall. But even this single branch required careful engineering. The horizontal channel ran 9 feet through the shared wall between the main room and the bedroom, passing above the doorway lintel, turning through 190-degree bend, and rising vertically through the bedroom wall to join the main flue above the roofline. The total flue path through the horizontal channel was 18 feet, with 42 square feet of interior masonry surface area for heat absorption. Even this single branch transformed the cabin. The bedroom, which had been unheated except for what warmth leaked through the plank partition wall, now had a warm masonry wall that kept the room above 50 degrees all night. Liddy's cough improved within the first month. The bedroom thermometer, which she had purchased at the same store where Helena bought hers, never dropped below 44 degrees that winter, even on the coldest nights. The previous winter, without the branching channel, the bedroom had dropped to 12 degrees on the coldest night, 32 degrees below freezing, cold enough to freeze the wash basin solid. Griggs's firewood consumption dropped from 5½ cords to 3 3/4, a savings of 1 3/4 cords, or approximately $9 per winter. The chimney rebuild paid for itself in 6 winters from firewood savings alone, and in the first winter from comfort. Griggs told every man in the valley that the Ukrainian chimney was the best $50 he had ever spent, and he said it with the enthusiasm of a man who had spent 2 years thinking about whether to spend the money and now regretted every day of the delay. By 1890, Terrace had built branching chimneys for 4 families in the valley. Each design was different because each cabin had a different layout, and the flue channels had to be routed through whatever walls were available, turning corners and navigating around windows and doorways. This was the skill that separated Terrace from a mason who could follow a plan. He could look at an existing cabin and see the flue paths the way a plumber sees pipe routes, finding the most efficient path through the structure to deliver heat where it was needed, with the minimum number of turns and the maximum amount of masonry contact. Each turn in a flue channel added resistance to the gas flow and reduced the draft, so fewer turns meant better draft and more reliable operation. Each foot of horizontal channel added surface area for heat transfer, so longer channels meant more heat extracted. The art was balancing these competing demands. Enough channel length for good heat extraction, few enough turns for reliable draft. And Taras balanced them by instinct developed over 30 years of building Piches in the Carpathians. The cost of a branching chimney versus a conventional chimney was approximately double. $50 versus $25 for a new build, including materials and labor. But the firewood savings of 1.5 to 2 cords per winter at $5 per cord meant the additional $25 was recovered in 2.5 to 3 winters. After that, the savings accumulated every year for the life of the chimney. Over 20 years, the total firewood savings were 30 to 40 cords, $150 to $200, from a $25 additional investment. And the firewood savings did not account for the comfort value of heated rooms that had previously been cold, or the health value of sleeping in warm rooms instead of freezing ones, or the productivity value of a warm workroom. Sefton adapted slowly. He watched Taras build 4 chimneys, and he watched the families use them through 2 winters, and he talked to the wives, not the husbands, because the wives were the ones who felt the difference most directly, the ones who slept in the newly warm bedrooms and worked in the newly warm workrooms and hung thermometers on the walls and kept track of the firewood pile. And eventually, he asked Taras to show him how to build a junction box. This was not a small thing for Sefton. He was 63 years old. He had been building chimneys for 30 years. Asking a man half his age, an immigrant who had been in the country for 6 years, to teach him something about masonry was an admission that his 30 years of experience had a gap in it, and Sefton was not a man who enjoyed admitting gaps. Taras showed him. He did not make a production of it. He did not lecture or explain theory. He simply built a junction box on a practice stand behind his cabin, narrating each step in his careful English, while Sefton watched and asked questions. He showed him the firebrick lining, how the firebrick had to be laid with the smooth face inward so the gases flowed over a clean surface that would not accumulate soot as quickly as rough stone. He showed him the channel dimensions, 8 inches wide by 6 inches tall, which Taras had arrived at through years of building Piches and which represented the optimal balance between gas velocity and heat transfer. A wider channel would slow the gas velocity, reducing the turbulence that promoted heat transfer. A narrower channel would increase gas velocity but also increase the resistance to flow, which would reduce the draft and could cause the system to smoke. 8 by 6 was the sweet spot. He showed him the damper mechanism, the clay collar, the clay plate, the iron rod, the way the rod had to pass through the masonry in a slightly oversized hole packed with loose clay so that the rod could rotate freely without binding. He showed him how to calculate the flue path length based on the firebox size and the number of rooms to be served. A larger firebox produced more gas volume and needed longer channels to extract the same percentage of heat, while a smaller firebox needed shorter channels to maintain adequate draft. He showed him the rule of thumb that his father had taught him. For every additional room served by a branching channel, the vertical flue section above the junction must be at least 2 feet taller to maintain adequate draft, because each horizontal channel added resistance to the system, and the additional vertical height was needed to create enough draft to overcome that resistance. Sefton learned. He was a competent mason, and the branching chimney was not beyond his skills. It was beyond his experience, which was a different thing, and once the experience was provided, he could execute the technique reliably. His first branching chimney, built for a family named Burnham on the north side of the valley, worked correctly on the first fire. The channels drew cleanly, the dampers operated smoothly, and the bedroom wall warmed to 100 degrees within an hour. Sefton came to Taras afterward and thanked him, and the thanks was genuine, and the two men respected each other after that in the way that craftsmen respect each other when they have shared knowledge honestly. By 1895, Sefton was building branching chimneys as his standard offering, and he charged $60 for a two-channel system, $10 more than Taras, justified by the claim that his channels drew better, which was not true, but which customers could not easily verify. Taras did not compete on price. He competed on quality and on the reputation he had built over 10 years of flawless chimneys, and the families who hired him did so because they wanted the man who had brought the technique to the valley, not the man who had learned it from watching. By 1895, 9 homes in the valley had branching chimneys. The total firewood consumption of those 9 homes was approximately 33 cords per winter, compared to an estimated 54 cords if they had used conventional fireplaces. 21 cords saved per winter across 9 families. $105 saved per winter. 105 days of cutting labor saved per winter. This was not a small change. This was a structural shift in the economy of heating in the valley, achieved by one man's knowledge of a technique that was 500 years old in the Carpathians and completely unknown in Pennsylvania. The technique did not spread beyond the valley. Taras did not advertise. He did not write about the method. He did not patent it, though the design would likely have been patentable. The specific configuration of a junction box with rotating clay dampers, feeding horizontal firebrick line channels through shared walls, was novel in American construction and met the standard of inventive step. But Taras was not a man who thought in terms of patents. He was a man who thought in terms of chimneys. He built chimneys for families who asked, and the families who asked were the families who lived close enough to see the results in their neighbors' homes, and the knowledge stayed local. When the coal industry arrived in the valley in the late 1890s, bringing cheap coal that could be burned in cast-iron stoves with simple straight pipes, the economic advantage of the branching chimney diminished. A cast-iron parlor stove cost $8 to $12, could be installed in any room with a stovepipe punched through the wall, and burned coal at a cost of approximately $2 per ton, enough to heat a single room for a month. A family with 2 stoves in 2 rooms could heat their entire house for $15 to $20 per winter in coal, with no masonry work, no chimney rebuilding, no 5-week construction project. The branching chimney was a superior heating system, more efficient, more durable, more comfortable, and it produced radiant heat from the walls that was more pleasant and more even than the intense localized heat of a cast-iron stove. But it required a skilled mason and 5 weeks of labor, and in a coal economy, that investment was harder to justify when a $12 stove and a tin pipe could put heat in any room within an afternoon. Taras built his last branching chimney in 1901 for a family named Griggs, a nephew of Abner, building a new cabin up the ridge. The nephew had grown up in Abner's cabin with the warm bedroom wall and had never known a cold sleeping room. And when he built his own place, he wanted the same, and he wanted Taras to build it. Taras was 63 by then, and the work was harder on his knees and his back than it had been 16 years earlier. But his hands were as steady and his eye as sharp, and the chimney he built for the young Griggs was as sound as any he had ever built. It was also his last. After that, the request stopped. The valley was converting to coal. Cast-iron stoves were appearing in every cabin. their stovepipes puncturing the log walls at odd angles, the cheap tin chimneys rusting and needing replacement every few years, a contrast to the stone chimneys that lasted decades. But the convenience and the low initial cost won out over durability and efficiency, the way they always do when cheap energy is available. Terrace returned to general masonry work, foundations, walls, repairs, and the branching chimneys he had built continued to function perfectly, heating rooms with a single fire for decades after the technique that built them was no longer in demand. Several families continued to use their branching chimneys even after installing coal stoves in other rooms, because the radiant heat from the warm walls was more comfortable than the intense localized heat from a cast iron stove, and the firewood that fed the branching chimney was free from the family's own woodlot, while the coal had to be purchased and hauled. The Koval chimney lasted 40 years. It heated 3 rooms from a single fire through 40 Pennsylvania winters without a single structural failure, without a single channel blockage, without a single damper replacement beyond the clay plates that Helena made and Terrace installed every 5 to 7 years as the originals cracked from thermal cycling. The firebrick lining of the flue channels showed no deterioration after 40 years. The clay straw mortar that Helena had mixed held firm, and the firebrick surfaces were as smooth and intact as the day they were laid, coated with a thin glaze of creosote that actually improved their heat transfer properties by creating a smooth, dense surface. The riverstone exterior showed some weathering, surface lichen on the chimney cap, a few spalled faces on stones that had been exposed to direct rain. But the structural integrity was undiminished. The mortar joints were tight. The flue channels drew cleanly. The dampers still operated, the iron rods turning smoothly in their clay-packed holes. 40 winters, 3 1/4 cords per year, 130 cords total over 40 years to heat a 3-room cabin that would have required 250 cords or more with conventional fireplaces. 120 cords saved, $600 saved. 600 days of cutting labor saved, from a chimney that cost $12 in materials and 5 weeks of one man's time. Helena kept her temperature records for 22 years, from the first winter in 1885 through the winter of 1907, filling 3 small notebooks with daily morning readings from the thermometers in the sleeping room and workroom. The record showed a remarkable consistency. The sleeping room morning temperature averaged 53 degrees over 22 winters, with a low of 44 degrees on the coldest nights, and a high of 62 degrees during mild spells. The workroom averaged 48 degrees. These temperatures were maintained with a single evening fire that burned for 3 to 4 hours and then died to coals, the masonry holding and releasing the stored heat through the night. 22 years of data, 22 years of warm rooms from warm walls from a single fire fed through branching channels of stone. Nobody wrote it down. No engineering journal documented the technique. No agricultural extension service recommended it. The branching chimney was a solution so effective that it should have changed the way Americans built houses, and instead it heated 9 homes in one valley in western Pennsylvania and disappeared when cheap coal made it unnecessary, and the man who carried the knowledge grew old, and the families who benefited from it moved away or died, or simply forgot where the warmth in their walls had come from. But the physics has not changed. Hot gases still surrender heat to masonry in proportion to contact time and surface area. A longer flue path still extracts more heat. A branching channel still delivers warmth to rooms that have no fire. The principle that Terrace Koval carried from the Carpathians to Pennsylvania, that a chimney is not a waste pipe, but a heat delivery system, that the flue is not an exhaust, but an opportunity, is as valid today as it was when the Hutsul people first routed hot gases through clay channels in their mountain houses 500 years ago. No myths, no miracles, just stone, fire, clay dampers, and the patience of a warm wall that remembers the heat long after the flames have died.